Welcome to Tuesday Lunch and Learn. I'm James Shore. Every week we come up with a software engineering problem, come up with a challenge related to that question, and then solve it live on stream. And this week it's logging. If you'd like to follow along, you can check out the code from GitHub, github.com/jamesshore/livestream. This tag right here, 2020-08-11 is the one that you're going to want. Your questions and comments, as always, are welcome. Go ahead and toss them in the chat, and I'll take them as we go. And we also have time at the end for more questions if there are any. Now, before we get started, I have a big announcement to make. For the last couple of months, I've mentioned that Bellet, welcome, Uncle Scientist. Glad you could both make it. For the last couple of months, I've been saying that I'm working on a secret project, and I wasn't ready to announce it yet. But I am very happy to say that I'm ready to announce it. What I've been working on is the second edition of my book, The Art of Agile Development. And not only that, it is about to come out in early release on O'Reilly. So in the next couple of weeks, you should be able to get access to all the chapters I've written so far. I've written chapter 1 and chapter 2. And then as I continue working on chapters, they will come out on O'Reilly early release. So if you'd like to see, if you're interested in that, you'd like to follow along, go ahead and follow the hashtag AOAD2 on Twitter, or you can follow my website, jamesshore.com/s/new. We'll get you all the latest stuff, or I have an RSS feed, jamesshore.com/s/RSS. In addition to the early release, I'm also planning on developing the book live. So as I finish material, I'm going to be putting it up on my website for feedback and comments. So definitely check out those tags if you're interested. I'm really excited about this edition of the book. First edition was pretty popular, but it came out 13 years ago. I've learned a lot since then. I'm going to be putting all of what I've learned into this second edition of the book. And to celebrate next week's live stream, that's going to be Tuesday, August 18th at noon Pacific. That is going to be all about the upcoming book. I'm going to actually read out the first chapter live, and we can have discussions about the book, about any Agile concepts. So I hope you'll come and join us for that. Third man, welcome to the stream. Glad you could make it. So that's my big news. I've been working on this for a long time, and I'm looking forward to now sharing it with you, all of you. Okay, let's get to today's challenge. So today's software development topic is logging, specifically making logs testable. Logging, of course, is critically important anytime you have server-side software, even client-side software these days. You want to be informed when things go wrong. And so we need logging in our code, but it's often kind of a pain to test, so it often doesn't get tested. It's just sort of smashed in there. It works or it doesn't, who knows? We just sort of cross our fingers. So our challenge today is to actually log our errors in our microservice. Several episodes ago, we had a series called Microservices Without Mocks, and you can find that in the backlog here, jamesshore.com/s/LNL. That's LNL for Lunch and Learn. There's a 4-part series called Microservices Without Mocks, where we built a little microservice that would do row 13 transformations. And it did a really good job of handling errors, but it didn't have any mocks, or it didn't have any logs. And let me show you what I'm talking about here. Pellet has a comment. As someone who is artistically challenged, what is the meaning of the book with a fish in the glass with a twig? Yeah, thanks for asking, Pellet. I'll get back to that at the end. You might need to remind me, though. So he was, of course, talking about the second edition of The Art of Agile Development. So here we are. I've got our microservice code running. So if I run it, I can run it with run 5000. And actually, that reminds me, if you'd like to follow along, again, you're going to check out github.com/jamesshore/livestream. Check out the tag 2020-08-11. You'll need node.js installed. And after that, everything is vendored in. You can run the build by doing /build.sh or just build on Windows. That will lint all the code and run all the tests. You can also use build quick to only lint and test the things that have changed. And you can use watch to lint and test whenever files change. And that will also make a little sound like that when the tests pass or fail. To run the code, we're going to use /run.sh, or just run on Windows, and give it the port. That will start the server. And we can actually post something to this service using my favorite command line HTTP tool, which is HTTPy. I'm going to say post to port 5000, the ROT13 transform endpoint, send in some JSON like that, and it's going to give me back the transformed output. But if I modify this code, let me close this down and show it to you. So here we've got the code, and right here in the routing part of the code, we've got our router. And if this router throws an error, then our code will handle that error gracefully. So let me go ahead and post again. We're going to see we get an internal server error. Great. But we don't have any sort of way of knowing it. We've got sort of rudimentary logging that just uses the command line, but it doesn't tell us that we got an error. So that is what I want us to fix. That's our challenge for today, is we need to log our errors. We need to modify the HTTP server so that it doesn't just handle the errors gracefully, but it logs it so we can do something about it. So that's our challenge: introduce logging to the HTTP service, make sure it's properly tested. How are we going to do that? Well, I'm going to let you ruminate on that for a moment. While you're thinking about it, I want to remind you that this show is made possible by the people who hire me for training and consulting. I tend to work with low bureaucracy companies or divisions within larger companies. People who have the capability for a lot of business agility, but they don't have the capacity from a technical perspective. They don't have the capacity that they want. So I do everything from training about test-driven development, like you're seeing here, all the way up to process design and large-scale systems development. When you have multiple teams working together, you often get bottlenecks between the teams, and solving that is a process problem, it's a social problem, and it's also a technical problem. So if you'd like so people hire me to help out with that, as well as other sorts of agile capacity problems. It is thanks to these fine people that I'm able to do this for you today, because if I didn't have them paying me to do consulting for them, I'd have to get a real job, wouldn't be able to do these live streams, which actually take a surprisingly large amount of time to prepare. Anyway, if you'd like to help support the show join this group of fine people, go ahead and send me an email, jshore@jamesshore.com, or you can visit me online, jamesshore.com. I also welcome tweets from anybody at jamesshore. Go ahead and drop me a line. Anyway, let's get back to our challenge. We want to modify our HTTP server so that it logs errors, and we also want to make sure that that's tested. How are we going to do that? Well, what we're going to do is build an infrastructure wrapper, just like we have been. And again, you can check out those back episodes here, jamesshore.com/s/LNL. The difference here is that we're going to be building a high-level infrastructure wrapper. Rather than having our infrastructure wrapper talk to the outside world directly, instead, we're going to be talking to a command line and a clock that we've already built. And if you want to see how we built the command line, go ahead and check out the Testing Without Mocks episode. If you want to see how we built the clock, go ahead and check out the last several episodes, which are called International Dates and Times and Testable Output and other things dealing with clocks. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to use those libraries that we already have. Now, high-level infrastructure is really just like any other sort of infrastructure wrapper. We wanted to hide the implementation details. The major difference is that because we're using our own libraries to talk to the outside world, it's going to be a lot easier to test. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. I'm going to go ahead and put this back to the way it was and run our tests. And let's see what we can see. All right. So what we're going to build is a logger, and I've sort of stubbed it in for you, and I've got it set up so that if you were following along, I actually publish the source code typically the day before, or sometimes a couple of hours before, so people can try out the challenge on their own, or you can check out again this tag here and try the challenge on your own. And to make that easier for people, I did sort of stub in the log and get that set up in the HTTP server so it's already to use. But there's obviously nothing here. So let's go ahead and just see that our tests are running. There we go. So we're going to need to build this log utility so that it, well, actually logs stuff. And I think the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to have it output our time, the current time, and we're going to have it output a message. So let's do that. It outputs current time. So we're going to need a log, and that doesn't exist, so we'll need to require it. And we're going to do something with that log. Let's say we'll log an info line. That doesn't exist, so we'll need to add that, but I won't put anything in it just yet. And then we're going to need to assert that we got something back. But in order to assert that we got something back, we need to be able to see the output. And in the past, when we've dealt with infrastructure wrappers, we've had to do all this complicated stuff about seeing, we had to spawn out to another module, see that it wrote out to the standard out. But in this case, we've already got all that stuff ready to go. So we don't need to bother with any of that. We can just take our existing command line and create ourselves a null command line. And we'll do the same thing for clock, because we're going to need one of them too. And now we've got our command line and clock all ready to go. We can pass those into our constructor. And we can even use the stuff we built last week. And again, that's jamesshore.com/s/LNL. Look for the, what is it called? It's the nullable output episode is what we're looking for, what you're looking for. We can even use that to see what goes out to standard out. So we'll just track standard out like that. And once we've done that, we can assert that on standard out, we got what we're looking for. And what are we looking for? Well, I'm going to say we're going to expect January 1st, 1970 at, let's see, how is this going to look? At January 1st, 1970 at midnight UTC, we're going to get our log message. So to do that, we'll need to specify that we're starting at time 0. It defaults to time 0, but I like it to be a little more explicit. And command line is not defined. What, did I misspell it? Yeah. Third man asks, is there a reason why you use new log instead of log.create? Yes, there is. Our create is going to be for people to actually create the log, and it's not going to take any parameters because we're going to abstract all the implementation details. But for our test, we want to be able to inject our command line or a clock. So I'm using that. Now, in another language, I might have used a private constructor and a public constructor and used method overloading. But in JavaScript, that's not an option. So in fact, we are going to need to pass in that command line and log clock to our log. So let me go ahead and make that constructor. Command line and clock, and I'll store those off. Like that. Okay, so now we're expecting our time. Now we can output that here. First, I'll just confirm that our tests are working by writing something to standard out. Yep, we're seeing that there. Good, now we can write the actual time. And to do that, we're going to use our clock. Our clock has something on it called toFormatted_string, and that takes the international date, time, and format options and a locale. The locale I'm going to use as the US area. And the options I'm not sure about yet. So let's go ahead and just try it. And this needs to be time. Okay, we need a time zone. So that's going to be UTC. And then we're getting a date, but it's not really the format we want. So the date style, well, let's try the medium date style. Yes, and now we need some time. So we'll go with the long time style. I believe that's the one that has the time zone in it. But that's giving us 12-hour time instead of 24-hour time. So let's say that we don't want 12-hour time. And that's almost what we want, except that I think I'd like midnight to be 0, because in a log, I want it to read more sensibly. So we'll, instead of using 12-hour time or doing it this way, what we can say is, let me look at my cheat sheet, hour cycle is what we want. Okay, that's almost working. But we're getting some sort of weird failure. And I'm not sure why, to be honest. Oh, because I need to say deep equal here. There we go. It's a quirk of Moco, is sometimes things will not match, but the output won't tell you anything. And it's one of my least favorite parts of the way Moco works. Moco, of course, being the test framework we're using here in Node.js. Okay, so now we've got it outputting the time, but of course we need to output a message as well. And if you're familiar with sort of the old-fashioned or older approach to logging, you'd think, well, we're just going to log out a string. But actually the current modern approach to logging is to use structured output. And the reason for this is if we use structured output, then we can use our log aggregator to do searches and filtering and so forth on the details of the log without having to do string matching. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually output an object like this. Let's see. And we'll output that here, and then we'll expect that our result will be the time. Now the time could go in our structured output, but I like having it at the beginning as a regular string. It makes the logs a little bit easier to read, and it still can be parsed by the log aggregators just fine. I'm going to take this and I'm going to say that we're going to stringify our data, and that's the expected result. Now let's just check that manually. Yeah, that does look like what we want. So here in standard out, we'll output the time, a space, and then we'll stringify the data, which we'll get in right here. Okay, we're almost done with the basics. I think we also want to log an alert level though, specifically the info alert level. So let's say that our expected data isn't just the output, but it's actually going to have an alert level as well. And that's failing because we're not getting the alert. Now we can go ahead and add that in. We'll just say that our data is equal to an alert level of info, and then the rest of the data. There we go. So that's the basics, pretty straightforward. Now, because we're doing structured output, we do need to handle, it's going to stringify most things, but errors, I know just from experience, errors require special handling. We want it to output the full stack trace for errors. Now this, whether or not you need to special case this is going to depend on the language you're using, but in JavaScript, you do. Now I'm going to want to get all of this stuff again, and rather than do that, I'm going to factor it out into a method. I'll call that create log. And let's have it put the log first. It doesn't actually matter, but it makes it more readable in my opinion. So it matters to me as a human, even though it doesn't matter to the computer. So create the log like that, and then we can just use that here. So the data in this case is going to be a new error. And we'll log that. And we can't just do a deep equal on this because we're going to want the error to include the full stack trace, and we don't want to have to be constantly updating our test anytime that stack trace changes. So instead what I'm going to use is a regex here. I'm going to just look at the first line of our standard out, and I'm going to match it and say that we, yes, do expect the sort of 1970 and the time. And then we'll have the error, which will be error. No, actually, it's going to have to be structured, isn't it? So we'll have the alert, which will be info, and then the output, which will be error, my error. But then after that is going to be the stack trace. And we do want to say we're getting the stack trace. So I'm going to say we get a new line and then 4 spaces, which is how stack traces work in JavaScript, and then at. But then after that, don't know what it's going to be. So this is how our string is going to start, and then it's going to go off and have the stack trace, which we won't specify in our test. Now, if I run this, it's going to fail because what you can see is that error, it's not stringifying. It's just not coming out at all. So obviously we have to special case that. So back here in our info, we'll say that our output is a new object. We'll get all of the entries out of our data. We'll loop over those. And our output is going to have equal the name value pairs. And this should work exactly the way it did before. It should feel the same way. We're still not getting the error. So now we can say that if the value is an error, then we'll say that the value is actually the stack trace. And that should give us the error, the message, and the actual stack trace. And I thought that would work. We're getting January for blah, 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 alert info output. Oh, and then down here, I'll need to use our output. And there we go. Nice. So that's giving us our stack trace for our errors. Next, what I want to do is I want to have this output multiple alert levels. You know what? Let's come back to that in a moment, because I think there's something else that we can do first that will make that a little bit easier. And that is tracing or tracking. So we want to be able to track the output. And just like you're seeing here for our standard out, we can track the standard out and then return it, and then we can make assertions on it. We're going to want to have a similar capability in our log. In fact, I've already stubbed it in right here. Now, I mentioned before that infrastructure wrappers are just like normal, or high-level infrastructure wrappers are just like normal infrastructure wrappers in that they hide the implementation details. It's going to be tempting here to say, well, if we want to track the command line, we'll just pass it in, we'll inject it, and then the caller can call command line.trackOutput on their own, and they have access to everything they need. And yeah, you could do that. But now what you're going to be doing is you're going to have the caller is going to have to deal with all this junk. You've got the timestamp, which is going to be changing constantly. You're going to have the having to deal with the fact that the data is stringified. When you're doing a high-level infrastructure wrapper, you want to hide the details. You want to make this easy to use, just like any other infrastructure wrapper. So what we can do for our track output is we can actually simplify this so that it's better than just calling track standard out. Let me show you what I mean here. So we're going to say that it can track the output. So we'll get our log, and we will call track output on that. And that's going to work because it's stubbed in. And then we'll log something. and we'll assert something here. Now we could assert a string, but when we're testing this, we're going to want to know that we're going to be checking that we output the correct structured data. So rather than tracking it as a string, I think we should track it as the actual structured data that we put in. So I'm going to say that we're going to expect that our that we're going to equal, their output is going to equal, well, the expected output. And in fact, let's take this and make it our data, and then we'll have expected data, which is going to be the alert of info and the output of my output. And I guess I'll name this expected output. I don't know if I like expected data or expected output better. So we're expecting something to come out, but obviously it's not. Now implementing this is pretty easy. There was a question last time of whether or not we could abstract out the tracking code that we did. And the answer is yes, in fact. In fact, what I've done is I've made an infrastructure helper, which does exactly that. There's a track output utility function, takes an event emitter and the event to track, and will actually set up your output tracker for you. So it's just a matter of us using that. So I'm going to go ahead and import that. Our infrastructure helper there, and we'll just return infrastructure helper dot track output. We'll need to pass in an emitter and an event, which I think I'll call output event. There's our output event there. And for our emitter, we'll need to require the node.js event emitter. And then here, we'll make it. So now we're tracking the output. Let's see, that did not work the way I expected. It's because this should be emitter. There we go. Now we're tracking it, but we're not actually getting any output out, and that's because we're not emitting the event. So we'll say here that we want to emit to the output event our data, our structured data. And there we go. Now we've got a really nice tracker that is going to make our tests super easy to use. Of course, errors are still special. Now this will give us the actual error object, and that's good in a way, but that error object is going to have a stack trace on it. And just like we saw up here, dealing with those stack traces means having to do regexes, and we don't want to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to have our tracker not give us the stack trace. It's going to strip the stack trace off. Let's see, tracker strips stack traces. So we'll make our log and we'll track the output. In fact, we're going to do basically this same thing here. And as usual in tests, I'm okay with more duplication than I am in production code because I think it makes the test easier to read. So here, our output is going to be new error, my error. And here, the output's going to be, rather than having a stack trace, it's just going to be error, my error. And we're getting a weird error message out of this. And the reason is that it sort of matches and it sort of doesn't. Again, this is just a flaw in Mocha, I think. So what we need to do here is we need to do the same thing. We need to special case the emitted output. So I'll make another object here. And we'll say that our output value defaults the value unless value is an instance of an error, and then the output value is equal to the stack. And here it's going to be output value. And then we can do the same thing for the emit value. Except the emit value is going to equal the name and message of the error. And then down here, we can use the emit value. Except not the emit value, just the emit object. Okay, I expected that to work. So what did I do wrong? We're logging the data, got the output, got the emit. We forgot to actually put the emit value on the emit object. There we go. So now we have the ability to output the time, the deal with errors, structured data. We can track it. We can deal with errors when we're in our tracker. We are pretty much done here. I think I just need to do the multiple error levels, and I'm going to put that back up here. We'll say it provides multiple alert levels. Now, the reason I postponed doing this before is because I thought it would be easier to test if we had the tracker already in place. I didn't want to have to deal with this, this mess of all this stuff every time. So let me go ahead and I'll get our log, and we'll create the log, and we'll get our output. You know what? I don't want to be doing this over and over again like this. Let's go ahead and take the output and put it down here and return it as something that we can track. Yeah. I think I'll leave it here in this test to make it so when people are looking at the can track output, it's clear how you track the output. But here, I don't think I need it. I can just grab the one that we got from create log. And then up here, in our multiple alert levels, I'll use the one that's provided to us by create log as well. And now what I can do is I can say log the info, log info, and I don't care about the data in this case. And then I'll assert that our output is equal to alert info. And this should work. It's already done. But now I'm going to add a debug log level. And that's failing because we don't have it. So I'll start out, just copy this. We'll call this one debug. There we go. Of course, this is not at all good enough. So I'm going to factor this out. I'll take this and I'll turn it into an alert variable, and then I'll collapse that. Then I'll take all of this and I'll extract it into a method, which I'm going to call do log. And then let me take this and put it down here. Now, WebStorm by default uses the call option so that this is implicit and allows us to have this used down here, but I prefer to make it more explicit. I think it reads a little bit easier, especially for people who are not as familiar with JavaScript. So I'll just do that. I will pass self in explicitly and not use the call option. And that is exactly the same code. And now I can inline this, but I think I want the data to come last. So we'll move that. There we go. And now we can do the same thing for info here. Except that we need to have a different alert level. So there we go. Next up, we need the higher level alerts. Now there's a variety of different alerting approaches, and there's sort of a standard way of doing it, but I don't like that standard way very much. I actually prefer in my alerting to say info, which is just info, which doesn't need any action, then monitor, which is an alert level I used for saying, hey, pay attention to this. There's nothing wrong yet, but keep an eye on it. And then action, you need to take action on this. And not necessarily right away, but pretty darn soon. And then emergency, which is, hey, take action right now. Now, of course, you're going to have your own alert levels. And if you're working in any sort of established environment, they're probably already defined and you don't have any control over it. But if you do have control over it, I like making my alerting just a little more explicit so that when the alerts come in, I know what to do with them. So let's just do these one at a time. We'll do monitor next. That's going to fail because we don't have it. And now I can make it. Now I do like that we factored out our do log, but because JavaScript has higher order functions, we actually have the ability to do something a little bit nicer here so that we're not doing do log over again. We can actually make a function to make the alerting function because they're all the same. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say this.debug equals our log function for debug. And we'll pass in this. If we do this right, we won't need to have a separate method for it. Take the self and the alert level, and then we'll just return a function which takes the data and then calls do log with the self, alert level, and the data. And this is just nice. It makes it a little easier to put the alert levels in and to read it. Well, maybe not on the reading it. You'll have to decide for yourselves whether this is too clever or not. If you wanted to be super clever, you could even put these different log levels in an array and then have your constructor loop over that array and define the functions programmatically. And I actually did try that in my rehearsal, but I thought that it made it a little too hard to read, so I'm not going to go quite that far. Charlie Pancakes asks, down here in the do log, I presume, is output a const if we're adding properties to it? Yeah, it is a const, but not in the way you might think, Charlie. Output here, just as with any objects in JavaScript and in most languages, output is a reference to the object. So the output reference is const. I can't change that, but the underlying object is not constant. There's no way to make the underlying object const yet. There is actually a proposal in the going through the JavaScript process to make immutable records, which are going to be like objects except they're constant, but we're not using that here. So long story short, the reference is constant, the object is not. Thanks for the question. Okay, so now we've got our different log levels. We can add action and emergency. By doing this, action, emergency, and action and emergency. Okay, there we go. Now we've got our log levels, we've got the structured output, we've got the tracking. We are pretty much done. The only thing that we haven't done yet is make sure that people other than our test can actually create and use this. So we're going to need to test the create function. Now, I said that high-level infrastructure wrappers were just like regular infrastructure wrappers, except they're easier to test. And that's because we're not having to do all the focused integration tests on the infrastructure. With one exception, I think we do want to check that this works for real. Uncle Scientist asked about enabling and disabling log levels. You know, honestly, that's not something I use a lot in my own code. I just use my output trackers to filter, or my log aggregator to filter. So it's not something that I've got planned for today's exercise. But if that's something that you wanted to do, then sure, you could do it. You might wonder about, well, what about the debug? We don't want all kinds of debug output coming in. I actually set up my code so that it's not possible to deploy debug logs. um, I just do it in local development. And then if I have something that needs to be deployed, I'll do it as an info. So yeah, I don't disable logs. But again, if you want to add that, it's something that you're welcome to do as an exercise on your own. So we need the ability to actually see that this is created and used. And this is the one case where I'd make sure that it actually does output to the command line. Your high level infrastructure is infrastructure. We need to make sure it works all the way out to the outside world. So let's say that it writes to standard out. And to do this, we're going to have to actually write a module that writes to standard out. And because of the way standard out works, the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to get our test helper. Let me go ahead and grab that. I'm going to have our test helper, and it has a run module async, which I have to remember to await. And that takes the current working directory. And I think that's directory. I hope I got that right. Oh no, I think it's dir name. And then it's going to take a module name, which I'm going to call log test output runner. And then we can assert that we get what we're expecting on standard out, which is going to be the normal stuff. Let's see, I think we'll need to... Oh, you know what? We're gonna have to do this as a match because it's gonna be the current time and we don't know what the current time is. So let's just match that to be something followed by UTC, followed by our output, which is gonna be my output. And then that should be it. That's going to fail. By the way, you may have noticed that we restarted. You might be worried that there's a memory leak in our code. And the answer is there is a memory leak in our code. It's in the watch script. For some reason, I don't know if this is a bug in Node or if I'm doing my watch script incorrectly, but when we clear out the module cache in the watch script, that memory is not reclaimed. So every so often we have to restart the watch script. That's something I actually only discovered last time when I was doing the memory leak checking for the nullable output. Anyway, it's saying we can't find our log test output runner, so let's go ahead and make that. We have log test output runner. And this will have our log in it. Now we're getting the correct failure. We're getting no string out, but we expect it to give our output. So for our output, we'll create the log, and then we'll do some info with my output. And now we're getting a failure. It's trying to call toFormatted_string on clock, but clock is undefined. And that's because here in create, we're not actually passing through the stuff we need in our constructor. So we'll pass through a real command line and a real clock. And that should be all we need. I'll just go ahead and require those. And there we go, our code works. I do need to make sure that our test works properly though. And I've got, because the watch script is an incremental build, I need to tell it that we're looking at log test output runner as a dependency. Let me just make sure I got that syntax right. Yeah, I did. Now this is not something you'd normally see in JavaScript. This is just for my watch script. You'll notice that it only runs the tests that have in the files that have changed. And the way it does that is by doing a dependency analysis, an analysis of the dependency graph of all the code. And it does that analysis based on require statements, but for the log test output runner, we don't have a require statement. So we need something else. So that's what that is. Okay, so we're writing to standard out, and that's good. All we have left to do now is the create null. That's pretty straightforward. We'll just come down here, put at the bottom like I'd like to have all my nullability stuff, and we'll say that well, we'll just basically do the exact same thing again, except we'll say it doesn't write to standard out. And we'll assert that standard out is equal to an empty string. Of course, oh, and we'll need to say log test null output runner. That doesn't exist, so it's going to fail. And I'll make a null output runner. Now it's going to fail because it's not using the null. So it's actually writing out. So we'll create null here. And now it's failing because, again, we don't have the clock or anything else. So let me just come back over here to our create null. And we can just pass through a null command line and a null clock. And this is the nice thing about high-level infrastructure is you can use all the stuff that already exists, makes it super easy. And that, I believe, is our logger all done. So I'm going to go ahead and check that in. I'll have this uploaded after the end of the stream under the tag 2020-07 or 08-11-end. But for now, I'll just check it in here. We've added a log. Now what we need to do is use it. So I'm going to go over to our HTTP server. There's the test. There's the production code. And the way HTTP server works is fairly straightforward. And again, if you want to see how that works, go to jamesshore.com/s/LNL and look for the microservices without mocks episode, specifically the first 2 episodes. And all these links are in the README as well in the source code. But ultimately, when a request comes in, it's handled right here by handle request async. And we are given a function to call whenever a request comes in. So we call that function. We check the response to make sure we've got a valid response. And if we don't, we return an error. And if we get an error, if an error is thrown, we return an error. So we just need to have this do the logging. In our tests, that is down here under requests and responses, surprisingly enough. And the specific tests we're going to modify are right here. Fails gracefully when request handler throws an exception, and fails gracefully when request handler returns invalid response. Now, for convenience, I set this up so we're already getting our log output. That's because the tests have a lot of stuff just to make it possible to test the server. But ultimately, what's happening is down here in create server, we're creating the null log, and then we're returning log output as a call to track output. And then that filters through the various stuff and comes back out right here and here when we call get async. So we can now use this output of our track log just by saying assert deep equal log output. We're only expecting 1. And we're going to say that the alert level is going to be, I think, an emergency in this case because we've thrown an exception we didn't expect. So something's gone terribly wrong somewhere and we need to fix it. We're going to have a message, which I think will be this message right here. And then we're going to want to have the error. And the error is going to be an error of on request async error. And that is a really nice and clean way to test our log output. I really like the way that works. That's going to fail. We're not getting any logs. Right here in our catch, we can do that. We can just say log, which I've already set up to pass through. We can say log emergency. We'll pass in request handler through exception and our error. And we'll need to put that in an object. and make that a message. There we go. It's just that easy. We can do the same thing here. Take our log output. We'll expect just one. The alert's going to be, again, I think emergency. And you could make this a constant. In fact, I would normally make this a constant on log, but I wanted to keep things simple for today, so I didn't do that. The message is going to be, I think, this message right here. And we'll get the actual response, which is going to be, let's make it a little more explicit, my invalid response. That's failing. We're not getting it. Again, implementing this, super easy. Message is this. And the response is right here. So we'll just put that into our structured log. I think we're pretty much done. I think the only thing I would finish up here is now that we're logging properly, we don't need to leak the internal state of our system to callers. So I'm going to take that out here and here. So that, of course, is going to fail, but it's very easily fixed. We'll just only pass it in here and here. And there. And there you have it. That is testing logs in a really nice and clean way. Now that this log wrapper exists, testing logs is going to be so easy for the rest of the system. I'm not going to do it today because we don't have time, but I think probably in a future episode we can do more about logs. Or as an exercise for yourself, you can take a look at putting logging in. There is some logging in Route 13 server. There's the opportunity for logging in the router that we didn't do, and very, very easy. You just need to pass the log into the object, which I did right here, save it off, and then use it. It's so nice the way it works, and I find it much more convenient than doing the mock-based approach. I see a question coming in on. A question came in the chat. I will take that in just a moment. Before that, I want to just wrap things up for you all. So what we've done here is we wanted to have our HTTP server log errors. So what we did was we built a high-level log infrastructure wrapper. And a high-level wrapper is just like a regular infrastructure wrapper, infrastructure wrapper, except that it uses the existing infrastructure wrappers instead of talking to the outside world directly. And we built the track output in this, although we could have just used the underlying command line's track output. We built our own track output so that we could hide the implementation details and provide a more convenient way of testing the log. And because we were using the low-level infrastructure, it was super easy to write and test the implementation of log. And now we log errors, and let me just demonstrate that for you. If I come back into here and we have our router throw an error, like we did before, and I run that here, and I try to post to it here, we get the internal server error, and there's our log message. Works first time, pretty much every time. All right. So there we go. I will take questions and comments in just a moment. Go ahead and put them in the chat if you have any. A couple of announcements first. Remember, next week is for Art of Agile Development 2nd edition. I'm going to be reading the first chapter live on the stream and also taking questions and having discussion around Agile in general, as well as the content of the book. So please come for that. Pellet, your question about why is the cover have a little sapling on it and a fish now in the 2nd edition. The first edition, it looks like this. Let's see, I'll put this up here for you. So the second edition, it's just the sapling's grown a little bit and they put the fish in there. I love the graphic design on that. Anyway, why does it look that way? Well, I think you'll have to come next week for me to answer that question. Sorry. I think there are a number of people who are curious about that. I'm happy to share that next week. That is going to be August 18th at noon Pacific. Talking about the second edition of Art of Agile Development. I'll be reading the first chapter live on stream as well. And again, I'm going to be developing this live. Developing it live. I'm going to be developing it out in the open. So as new chapters are finished, I'm going to be putting them on my blog, getting comment and feedback, and then they're going to go to the O'Reilly early release. So if you'd like to follow along with that, follow me on Twitter, follow the hashtag AOAD2 hashtag, or follow my RSS feed or new material on my blog, jamesshore.com/s/new or jamesshore.com/s/RSS. And I also want to remind you that these episodes are made possible by the people who hire me. If you liked what you saw today and would like to support the stream or have me come help your team, go ahead and send me an email, jshore@jamesshore.com, or visit me online, jamesshore.com. Whenever I do a private session, it's always in your language, using your libraries, often working in your actual code base. I work in Node.js, JavaScript on the server, Node.js, JavaScript on the client. I work with Java, and I work with .NET and C#. So I'd love to hear from you. Okay, lots of comments today. Thanks for the comments, everybody. I will take these starting at the beginning. So Nazar Chop says, all logger tests use the same date. Is clock usage something you don't worry is going to break? That's a great question. I'm not particularly worried about that breaking because the clock infrastructure is very thoroughly tested. That's something we did in a previous episode. So all I felt that I needed to test was that I'm actually doing the styling correctly and that I'm outputting the correct locale. And that is working. And then for the rest of it, I've got all of my clock tests here that test the formatting and the rest of it thoroughly. And again, you can check that out in the previous episodes. There's a number of episodes about that, in fact. We've got No More Flaky Clock Tests, which is about testing clocks, International Dates and Times, which is about the internationalization, and Nullable Output, which is about how the tracking works. And there's also, actually Nullable Output wasn't the clock. Then there's Idiot Proof APIs, which is about how we made the clock more robust against people using it incorrectly. Let's see. Thanks for the question, Nazar Chops. Pellet says, I haven't played around much with structured log data. Is there a tool you recommend that is good at parsing stuff like this? No, actually, I'm not really an ops guy, and all the places I've worked have just had the stuff that they've used. So I don't know what the ecosystem looks like or what I would recommend. If anybody has any suggestions on that, please put them in the chat. I'd love to hear it as well. Nazar Chup says, thanks. Logging is an interesting use case where log, clock, and output play together. I agree. I think this was a great example, I think, of how high-level infrastructure works. And I really like how easy it is to write this logger now that we've got the infrastructure wrapper in place. And in fact, this is something, in this show, we've spent a lot of time on infrastructure, so we've made it seem like doing this nullable output and all this infrastructure is really hard. But the fact is, you write this stuff, and most of your work is elsewhere, and you just end up using it over and over and over again, like you've seen here. You end up doing stuff like this test so frequently, and using the mock-based approach, you're constantly setting up your mocks all the time. Whereas using the nullable infrastructure approach, the log infrastructure is there, it works, we use it, and it's literally just a couple of lines to make the test. And the test, I think, in my humble opinion, super, super readable. I really like the way this comes out. Another comment from Third Man. Thanks for the comment. I would definitely like to learn more about your logging strategies, deciding log levels, placements, log data, preventing personal data leaking in a future episode. I think that is great. You know, this is just the beginning of what you can do with logging. And I would say that I'm not really an ops guy. I would say my approach is a little idiosyncratic. For example, I don't like to do debug log levels. I don't like that to be in production because I find that what happens is you tend to put in a ton of debug logs and they just corrupt up your application code base and your production logs. So I actually enforce that all debug log levels are stripped before it goes to production. I'd like to keep the logging more focused. But like I said, that's kind of idiosyncratic. Not everybody would agree with me on that. There's lots of other stuff that you can do to make your logging more useful. I'd love to have some more episodes on that. So thanks for the suggestion. And then Pellet says, back to the book cover, growing a sapling based on evolutionary design concepts. Or is this a tune in next week? Same bat time, same bat channel. It is same bat time, same bat channel. But yes, there's a longer story to why the cover looks the way it is. But I think you could argue that Agile is about adjusting your direction and a sapling grows towards the light. So if you need an interpretation of it, go with that one. But if you want the full story, tune in next week. Although it may not be as interesting as you might hope. I think there's a reason authors don't tell the why behind their decisions. It's because it's never as exciting as you might think. Anyway, that looks like all the questions, and it has been an hour. It's 1 o'clock my time. So thanks very much for watching, everybody. Again, next week, we're going to be looking at the Art of Agile Development 2nd edition. That is going to be at noon Pacific on Tuesday, August 18th. I'm going to check in the final code to GitHub in just a moment. It'll be github.com/shameshore/livestream. The tag is going to be 2020-08-11-and. Thanks very much for watching, everybody. I will see you all next time.